So now that we know about the AJAX and the APIs, let's actually make our first API call. So in this video, we're gonna build a nice UI component such as this one here, which contains data about a certain country. So just as we learned it in the last video, so here we have this card for Spain, and of course this will work for any country in the world. So to kind of magically get this kind of data from the internet and then work with it in any application that we are building. So let's now start working on this. And as always, I've already started a file up here in the VS Code, and I also already started the live server, and so that what I have here open. And so now let's get to work. Now in JavaScript, there are actually multiple ways of doing AJAX calls, but we're gonna start with the most old school one, and that's called XMLHttpRequest function. So we can do new XMLHttpRequest. So just this one here. So we call this function, and then all we need to do is for now is to show result in a new variable. So let's call this one a request. And so that's the first step of using the XMLHttpRequest way of doing AJAX calls. Now again, as I mentioned, this is the old school way of doing AJAX call in JavaScript, but I'm still showing it to you for two reasons. So first, I want you to know that XMLHttpRequest exists because you might actually need it in the future. And second, I want you to show how AJAX calls used to be handled with the events and callback functions. And so only after that, we should move on to a more modern way of handling asynchronous JavaScript, which is gonna be a feature called promises. But anyway, next we need the URL to which we will make the AJAX call. So we can now say request that object that we created here, dot open. And here, first we need to pass in the type of the request. And remember that the type of HTTP request to get the data is simply called GET. And second, we need a string containing the URL to which the AJAX call should actually be made. So let me now show you the API that I selected for this project, and also how to use it so that you can actually understand how you could do something similar yourself. So on GitHub, there is a huge repository, as you can see here, which is called public APIs. And so if you just Google for that, I'm sure you will find it. And here is a list of tons of public and free APIs that you can use. So we have all these different categories here. And so there's a really API for everything. So just as I said in the last video, and the one we are going to use is called REST countries. It's this one here. So we can see here that this is a big table. So we can see that the API we're going to use needs no authentication. I think it uses HTTPS. And I'm not sure about the codes. And this one here is important. So any API that you use here should always have a code set to yes or maybe unknown. And code stands for cross-origin resource sharing. And without codes, we cannot access a third-party API from our own code. And so go back here. So you can see it doesn't need authentication and it uses HTTPS. So this is a good one, and so click it, which will take us basically to the documentation page. And now here I'm simply looking for a so-called import API. This one here. And so the import is essentially just another name for the URL that we need. So here we have a first URL, and this one is basically for all countries. From this API, we can make an AJAX calls to this URL here, but this is not what we want. Instead, I want to search the API by country name, and so therefore this here is the URL that I'm going to use. So let's copy it, simply paste it here. I go to start with Spain, but you can of course use your own country. So with this, we basically open the request, and now next we need to also send it. You see, there's a lot of steps involved when using this way of doing an AJAX call. So this will now send off the request to this URL. Now, in order to get the result, we could simply do maybe something like this. So set the variable simply to this result here. And the reason why we cannot do this is because the result is simply not there yet, right? So this AJAX call that we have sent off here is being done in the background while the rest of the code keeps running. And so this is the asynchronous non-blocking behavior that we talked about in the last video. So let's get rid of this. And instead, what we need to do is to register a callback on the request object for the load event. So request, and then again at event listener, and here on the request we will wait for the load event. So again here we basically send off the request, and so that request then fetch the data in the background, and then once this is done it will emit the load event. And so as soon as the data arrives, this copy function here will be called. Now let's then actually log the result to the console, so that this keyword inside of this function is the request. So we could also do the request, but let's just use this keyword, and then the response is in the property response test. And again, this property here is only gonna be set once the data has arrived. So if you try to set it out here, then it will work, of course. So we can still try just to see the request, and so that will be exactly the same as this one. And already we have our first data here. That's great. As you see, this is the result of our very first AJAX call. So great job. This already worked, and you see that this kind of looks like a bunch of data about Spain indeed. Now we just need to convert this here to an actual JavaScript object, because what we have here right now is a JSON. So remember that JSON is basically just a big string or text, and so what we need to do here is to then convert that. And so thus JSON.parse this .response test. So let's take a look at the data. By the way, so as you see here, so of course the result of a response text out here is nothing, right? So get rid of this. And so indeed here we have this object with this all data about Spain. So we have the capital, which is the Madrid. We have a flag even, so basically a link to the image of the flag. And indeed, this is where we're gonna get the flag here from, and all kinds of this stuff. So even language, population, and currencies, and so on and so forth. Now you see that this is actually an array containing one object. So let's quickly restructure like this. So remember that this will be the same thing as doing this, but of course a restructure is a lot more beautiful. And so now we get immediately the object here, and now we can actually build card component. And so let's copy the HTML from here, this comment. So open the index.html file, get the HTML from here. And then we can create template literal. And as always, I'm calling it HTML. And so now all we have to do is to replace this data. So let's open it to see what we actually have. So here we are actually starting with the image. So we need a source, and of course that's okay with any URL, and doesn't have to be a local image that we have on our computer. And so the one we will use is this one here. And so that is at data.flex.png. Next up, this is where actual name of the country goes. So data.name.comment. So this one here. Then here I also enter region. So data.region, that will be Euro in this case, this one here. So that is a data.region. And then finally I also want some information about population, language, and currency. And all of that is present here in this data. So that's at the data.population, and so this here is basically 47 million. So we don't want to display this entire number, so let's just round it to 47.3 or 47.4 million. So the way we can do that is convert these first two number. So as always, I'm using plus for that, then divided by million. So yes, that's a million. And then let's round this value finally. So this is a number, and so a number we can call to fix with the one decimal place. So next up the language. So this is for languages. So data.language. So SPA for language, the same as currency. So currency data.currencies.eu .name. So data.currency.eu.name. And now all we have to do is to then actually insert this HTML into our page. I actually already have it here selected, but just to make it complete, let me show you too. So we have these country elements here, and so that's why I call the countries container. So here we want countries container insert adjacent HTML before in HTML that we just created. Now finally we also need to set the style of this container to opacity 1. So let me show you that one also in the code. So I set the opacity of the countries container here to 0. And so now we set it to 1 so that we can then see a nice animation which is gonna be triggered by this transition. And so just as I said, we need to say countries container dot style dot opacity, set it to 1. And now as I save it, data should appear. Yeah, it does. That's amazing, right?